I always talk about the gap that needs to be closed in Canada. And when you start talking about reconciliation, you can even break it down by sector: economic reconciliation, education reconciliation, justice reconciliation. Like, you can break it down. It just basically means that we need a bit, build a better quality of life for everyone in Canada. And that to me is what reconciliation really is. And the gap has to be closed. And what I keep talking about, the gap, is according to the United Nations Human Development Index, Canada is rated sixth. At one point, it was sixth in terms of quality of life. But when you apply those same indices to First Nations people, Indigenous peoples, we're 63rd. And so that's a huge gap. And when you start talking about sharing the land and sharing the resources, there shouldn't be any gap. And that gap represents everything we keep talking about, everything that we keep trying to fix. It represents the 1,200 plus missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. It represents the disproportionate number of our people in jails. It represents the 40,000 children in foster care. It represents the high youth suicide crisis that's there. It represents overcrowded housing, lack of access to potable, the gap. It's a huge gap. And that's why we keep pushing governments to do more, to invest in education and training and housing and water, to deal with the social determinants of health, if we're going to really start talking about reconciliation. And the TRC, that was the catalyst to wake up all of Canada, all Canadians, and all levels of government about the need to start looking at ways of doing things better, to really embrace reconciliation. And that's what we got to keep working towards. And even from the Assembly of First Nations, we're an advocate organization. And even before COVID-19 happened, we advocated for priorities to be in for example, the throne speech is what sets out the government's priorities and objectives for their upcoming government year. And so, the first time in the history of Canada, there was a whole chapter dedicated to Indigenous issues. And if you're not familiar with the throne speech, I'll just quickly highlight what was in that throne speech, because we pushed hard for these things. We pushed hard for that. There has to be a Liberal government bill on the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, not a private member's bill, but a government-backed bill on the UN Declaration. We talked about a national treaty commissioner, on behalf of the Crown, to make sure that the spirit and intent of the treaties are lived up to and abided by. We talked about the full implementation of C91, the language bill, C92, the child welfare, which is key because it recognizes First Nations jurisdiction and First Nations laws being paramount in Canada. We always say it's not just common law, civil law. There's also creators law, natural law that needs to be respected, First Nations law. Talked about the youth suicide, mental health as a priority. And it talked about the infrastructure gap to be closed by 2030, which is housing, water, connectivity. A lot of our communities still don't have access to internet, the whole list. So, and of course, the implementation of the missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, the National Action Plan, all of that was in the throne speech. And so with COVID-19, we're saying, yes, we've got to look at the health and well-being of our people and all Canadians in the whole world with this pandemic, but we cannot lose sight of all those things that were in that throne speech. So we have to hold as best as we can the government's feet to the fire so that we lose sight of all those things that were in the throne speech going forward. And I think if they're ever fully implemented, that will build a better Canada. And once you start investing in First Nations, Indigenous people's issues and recognize rights, title, and jurisdiction, you create economic reconciliation. And so the list goes on and on and on. We have a lot of work to do, no question. And we can only do that by engaging in meaningful dialogue and working together.